Hi, everyone. I first want to say thank you so much for inviting me. This is a super cool conference. I'm really excited to be here. Croatia is also very sunny and beautiful, so I'm excited to be here geographically as well. As was mentioned in the very nice intro, I'm a research scientist at DeepMind, and I also am affiliate faculty at Columbia and have a small group. Today I'm going to talk about some work that we've done at DeepMind recently on the neuroscience team. And the title of the work is Discovering Symbolic Cognitive Models with LLMs, which I realized that's actually not the title of my talk. It's apparently Discovering Symbolic Cognitive Models, which is not a word. Anyway, yes. Yeah, no, I appreciate the benefit of the doubt on that, but that was just straight up a typo. Before I get started, I want to just introduce some of the key characters that have contributed to this project. So Kevin Miller and I co-led this project at DeepMind. He's the co-senior author of the preprint in the paper that's out. Pablo Samuel Castro is the first author and also a core contributor to our effort. He's actually an RL researcher. He doesn't have a background as a neuroscientist before this project and is faculty at University of Montreal and got interested in this because he was looking for new and exciting inspiration for thinking about RL algorithms. And then Nathaniel Daw has also been consulting at DeepMind, and he's really played, among other things, an important role as a consultant expert who can help us work through the programs we're finding and interpret what they mean. These are the rest of the authors and contributors on the Cog FunSearch team at DeepMind. Okay, so our goal for this project is to find models of cognitive processes that are going to be useful for shedding some light about what kind of cognitive processes are happening in the brain. So the basic schematic of our setup looks like this. We're going to be trying to predict the choices of animals based on what outcomes they've experienced. So in one of our data sets that looks something like this, we have a rat that's making a choice. Maybe it decides to go to the left. It pokes its nose in a nose port on the left-hand side, and it gets some reward. Then what we want to do is predict what choice that animal is going to make next. So maybe the animal goes left again because it got reward, or maybe it goes right because it is exploring, or some other reason known only to the rat. The question is what kind of model we want to put in that box. And two features that make a model useful, among other things, are one, whether it's predictive, whether it's able to make accurate predictions about what choices the animal is going to make. And two, whether it's interpretable, if it can help us understand something new, if we can get some novel insight about the process that's happening. So if we were only interested in a predictive model, a strategy might be to just collect the largest data set we could, train the largest network we could, and get an entirely black box, but really accurate predictive model of what choices the animal is going to make next. And if we were just interested in a model that's really accurate, that would probably be the way to max that out. Historically, when we've been interested in interpretable models, what we've done is try to handcraft them, often motivated by some kind of normative principle in reinforcement learning or optimal decision-making that starts from a place of how should the animal do this behavior, how should one solve the task, and then add in parts in order to account for certain eccentricities or other idiosyncratic behaviors of the animal. And these kind of models are useful for shedding insight on a process, and they have terms in them that can be readily interpreted as components of a mechanism. A variable like prediction error, that means something. It's computing the difference between the actual and expected reward, and that has some role in a computation that we can understand. So what we're interested in doing is doing something that's kind of in between. We want to find models by fitting the data. We want to try to get models that are motivated by their ability to predict what's going to happen next, like the standard neural network approach. But we don't want them to just be entirely black box. And one way to approach that is to force them to have the structure of the kinds of programs that people write when modeling these tasks. So here we're going to try to discover programs that predict the animal's next choice rather than fitting neural networks. Why is this hard? It's worth briefly introducing this. So one is just that discrete optimization is hard. Finding a good program is harder to do with efficient algorithms than it is to fit the parameters of a neural network. You can't take gradients through it, and that's a really important step in fitting a neural network efficiently. The other is that program does not necessarily equal interpretable. There are a number of approaches for trying to find programs that optimize something. And just because something is in program form doesn't necessarily mean it's going to be interpretable. You could have these really long, complicated lines of code. Anybody who's gone back and looked at code they wrote like in their first computer science class or when they were early in graduate school knows that like code does not necessarily have to be interpretable. So the basic idea is that we're going to leverage a tool called FunSearch that was developed at DeepMind, which uses LLMs to discover programs. And these programs are in the form of Python code, and they're the kind of programs that are going to be generated by a large language model. So I'll go through in a bit of detail how we adapted that to our problem. So first, the schematic of what we're doing is we're evolving programs that have the following inputs and outputs. We take in the previous reward that was received by the animal and the corresponding previous choice the animal made. The program gets some parameters that are going to be specific to the animal and fixed over the course of an episode. They might be things like learning rate or exploration rate, but the program gets to decide what parameters it's going to have, what it'll name them, and how it'll use them. The program will also have a latent state that it updates, which can keep track of past information, past choices made by the animal. And we're going to try to optimize these programs in order to predict the next choice that's made by the animal. Cool. So in code form, and this is what the interface that the LLM is going to be interacting with, we're going to be taking in params, choice, reward, state. We'll have a program named agent, and we're returning a probability distribution over next choices as well as an updated state. This is a schematic of what this optimization process looks like. I'll go through the steps in detail, but first I'll just draw your attention to a topological detail, which is that this is all arranged in a loop. We're going to start with some programs and iteratively improve them over time. If you look inside score function, you'll see another tiny loop too. That's also an optimization process where we're fitting parameters to different subjects. So this is a bi-level optimization process. At the high level, we try to find a good program. And at the low level, in the inner loop, we are fitting specific parameters to each subject so that subject can have different parameters. So when we start off, we're going to start off with a prompt. This prompt is a chunk of code, which is going to mix code information as well as natural language information. So it might have some lines of documentation that can tell the LLM something semantic about the task, something maybe like find a model describing animal choices in an RL task. It then gets to see the way that we're going to score these programs. It's able to see what the score function looks like, so it knows how it's going to be judged. This score function will have something that says load the data, fit the model params, and then evaluate the model on a different held out test split of data. And then it'll return a score. And it also starts out with a program, so that's how it knows what the interface of the function will be. That could be something substantive, like a model we already know is good, or it could be something that just says to do, generate a model here, fill in code here. Something that kind of is technically a model, but it doesn't actually have any substance to it yet. We then take this prompt, we feed it to the LLM. The LLM is then prompted to produce an improved version of this function. And then we get a program that's generated from it. So that program might look something like this. It'll have lines of code. It'll also have comments. It might be really messy code. It might be really neat code. But it's some kind of program that we can get a quantitative score for. And that's what happens here. So once we have that program, we take the data set, and we fit the parameters of that program to each subject in our data set in order to get a maximum likelihood score for every animal. Then we average across those scores, and we get a single score for the program. Score and program are added to the database, and then programs are sampled from this database in order to be fed back into the LLM to generate new programs. The programs are sampled in a way that's related to their score, so higher scoring programs are more likely to be sampled. And this ends up implementing an evolutionary algorithm that's using an LLM as the generative component of that. Cool. Okay. So the particular data sets that we look at, we're looking at animals making choices in reward-guided learning tasks. So they all have the form I mentioned, where we're looking at the choice the animal got, the reward the animal got, and trying to predict the next choice. These are all reward-guided problems. They're n-armed bandit problems, which means the animal is going to have n choices, usually 2, sometimes 4, and will get some reward based on its choices. There's a couple reasons we wanted to look at this particular behavior. One is that, it's an interesting behavior. It's a classic, simple learning behavior, and understanding how animals do it is something that's really, interesting to us and hopefully to neuroscience at large. The other reason is a more practical one, which is that these are domains where very large data sets exist. There's high throughput pipelines for generating this kind of data, so we have a lot of data, which is a prereq for our method. And these data sets are also associated with strong baselines. People have put effort into trying to accurately model what choices an animal or human will make in this task, which means that beating it means something. Oftentimes in neuroscience, our model is not trying to just predict something as accurately as possible. We're not trying to be the strongest baseline. We're trying to get a model that's going to answer some question we have that the behavior is supposed to help us answer. And in that case, saying like, oh, we beat that model, might not be that exciting. The model wasn't trying to be as predictive as possible. But here in these cases, people have put a decent amount of effort into either searching literature or just trying lots of different models in order to model these behaviors accurately. So the particular data sets, we have data from humans doing a 4-armed bandit task on the computer. We have data from rats, 20 rats that are doing a 2-armed bandit task where they are selecting choices by poking their nose in nose ports. And we have a fruit fly data set that was collected with collaborators at Genelia, which is a Y maze, which sets up a 2-armed bandit. So you can see these are very different animals, and they're also very different tasks. The way in which the animal interacts with the environment is really different. In one situation, we have humans looking at a computer. In another, we have fruit flies embedded in an environment many orders of magnitude larger than their body. So some common task structure and lots of trials, but really different experience and very different animals. So a thing we'd like to be able to do but won't do in this talk is say like, oh, what are the commonalities across different animals? But because these tasks are so different, we're kind of not ready to make strong claims about that. So this is an example of depiction of data from each of these different tasks. And the main thing I want to draw your attention to here, each of these lines that's either purple or orange refers to the reward values that the animal is going to get. For rat and fruit fly data sets, those are reward probabilities. For the human data set, it's continuous valued reward, so that's just the actual reward. But the main feature here is these are changing over time, and that's a really important feature for eliciting continuous learning in these tasks. Cool, okay, so that's our method, that's our data, we're all set up. Now we're gonna look at how well our programs do. And first we wanted to just see, like, quantitatively, how are we doing? Are the models that FunSearch is discovering as good or better than the handcrafted baselines we've been using in the field? And also, how do they compare to black box neural networks? So here in blue, we have scores for the discovered programs that we find. In orange, we have recurrent neural network scores, which we're using as our stand-in, black box model. Each X here corresponds to a different animal in the data set. And this Y-axis is the difference in score between a data-driven method and the cognitive model baseline that previously existed in the field. So whenever an X is above the line 0, that means that the method is beating the cognitive model baseline. Whenever it's below 0, it means it's losing to the cognitive model baseline, that the existing model is better. So the FunSearch discovered programs are in blue. You can see, oops, can't see it. Okay, you can see that we're usually above the line 0, which, hooray. We're getting programs that are doing quantitatively better than baselines. That's a good thing. You can also see that in orange, the black box models are doing a bit better. For every data set, they're doing a little bit better. In some cases, it's really close. And in some cases, you can still see the gap, like for a rat data set. But the kind of key thing, like we're thinking that that's going to be an upper bound in terms of how well we can do. So the fact that we're closing the gap at all means, that's something we're happy about. We've gotten closer to the RNN performance than we were to the cognitive model baselines, but we still have some gap to go. So that's quantitative scores. That tells us something. The next thing we wanted to look at is a little bit more qualitatively, are these programs capturing some of the statistics of how animals make choices and how prior experience changes the choices that they'll make. So here, these are lagged regression plots. The x-axis here corresponds to the number of trials in the past. And what we're trying to do is predict the animal's current choice based on what happened n trials ago. So the x-axis tells us how many trials ago is n. And on the y-axis, we have coefficients for predicting the animal's choice. And in the subplot on the left, we're trying to predict the extent to which whether or not a trial in the past was rewarding is going to influence current choice. So the fact that this plot decays over time means, and that all of these coefficients are positive, means if a choice is rewarding, an animal is more likely to do it, and if the trial happened a long time ago, it's going to matter less. And the particular pattern of fall off is something that we wanted to capture. So in red, we have the performance for we have this plot generated for an example rat in our data set. And in blue, we have this plot created for synthetic data that we sampled from an agent that was fit to this with our discovered program. And we find these lines largely overlap, so that's good. It basically means that it's capturing overall this kind of statistical profile. The subplot on the right-hand side is similar, but we're looking at the effect of choice. So this is like independent of reward. To what extent does the fact that the animal chose left mean that it's going to choose left again? And we see a different profile, and our example rat and best rat program get the same thing. We generated the same thing for flies, and we're also able to find that our discovered programs capture the same patterns. This is a nice sanity check, because when I first saw the rat plot, we were all thinking like, okay, yeah, it's good that it matches, but like, you know, it's decaying. Maybe it's just always gonna get something decaying and look pretty similar. But the fruit fly and the rats show different profiles of decay, so it's a good sanity check that we can capture both of those with discovered programs. Cool, okay, so before we look at the programs, I wanted to show one more experimental result. So one thing that we experimented with is changing how we're prompting the LLM. So basically this is changing how much information we're giving the LLM about the task. In low info, we're basically hiding as much information as we can from the LLM. We're not telling it this is rat data, we're not saying it's a reward-guided learning task, we're just saying you're fitting a model, variables are named things like X and Y, so it just has to come up with a program without knowing that kind of context. In structured 1 and structured 2, we start adding informative variable names. Structured 2 has the addition of style hints in the form of comments about how the code should be structured. And in full model, we, in addition to giving it these semantic hints, we also give it a warm start by starting it with the best model that we know of, with the handcrafted human baseline. And it seems that different prompts vary in the extent to which they surpass the baseline. They can all eventually get there. Low info takes a lot of time. It's cut off here, but it will eventually meet it. The others get there faster. And you can see they kind of can leverage this prior information, as is represented by the ordering of these lines. So predictiveness, yay. And now we want to know how are we doing with interpretability. And so for that, we're basically just going to go through some programs and look at what they look like and see if we learn anything by looking at them. And I like to joke that this section kind of feels like a vacation slideshow. It's just like here's a bunch of programs and we'll go through them and we'll see what we see. So this on the left-hand side is the best human program that we got. We got this with a prompt structured 2, so this wasn't starting from the baseline. The best program happened to be one that started from scratch. If we look at the top, this is where we define all of the parameters. The program gets a parameter vector, and the first thing it does is break it up into named variables. And the first thing we see, which is maybe not setting the bar super high, but still something we were happy to see, is that it's often assigning interpretable variable names, things that either are meaningful or meaningful in the context of reinforcement learning. Things like exploration rate, lapse, prior, they have some kind of meaning and substantive interpretation that a human with some RL knowledge can look at and understand them. So that was the first thing we were happy to see. The other thing is that these variable names are largely indicative of the actual function they'll play in the code. The first thing you wonder is like, okay, it named it prior, but is that actually treating it anything like a prior? And not always, as I'll describe, but in a lot of cases, more often than not, these variable names are indicative of their real function. The other thing that Nathaniel noticed, which I don't think I would have noticed, is that the names are a bit biased towards being things from the psychology literature. rather than the computer science literature. So for instance, like perseveration, lapse, those are terms that are more common in psychology. Those terms would be called things like stickiness or epsilon in more of the computer science section of the RL code. So that is like kind of a loose indication that it's using some of the biased information that we're giving it in the prompt. Variable names are not always good. Sometimes they are vague or wrong, or as in this case, both. Attention bias 1 and attention bias 2 are not great names for parameters. They're pretty vague. Also, what they're doing in the code cannot really reasonably be construed as attention in any way, despite how vague that term is, or really even a bias. So it's not always sticking the landing there. And the other thing is that the LLMs cannot count. Apparently, this is a pretty ubiquitous phenomenon. They often try to use way more parameters than they actually have access to. It tries to index parameter 10, 11, 12, and this is beyond the length of the parameter vector that we gave it. In JAX, this doesn't cause an error. It just keeps re-indexing the last element in the array, in case you're curious about that. So that's defining the parameters. One of the interesting substantive things that we saw in this in this code, if we look at the snippets, is that it actually hard-coded a very high learning rate on reward-guided learning. So all of the programs find a high learning rate, and that's something that's been found in prior literature on this task too. But actually, the very best program doesn't even have a learning rate parameter at all to assign a high value. It just hard-codes it basically hard-codes a learning rate of 1, which means it's overwriting the previous value that it had stored for each choice. It's replacing, for each choice that the animal has available to it, it's just overwriting a biased version of what reward the human got on that trial. And this looks a lot like a working memory strategy, where you're just remembering what reward you got the previous time you took that action, rather than something more incremental. And this is consistent with some work that Ann Collins has done, hypothesizing that like working memory effects are really important in unarmed bandit tasks, especially when you don't have tons and tons of arms. It's also something that Maria Eckstein found when she was originally modeling this data set. Is a very high learning rate. Another thing we find is that we get memory for past choices and outcomes on different time scales. Here are all of the variables that this program decided to keep track of in its state. Q values is keeping track of reward, and then some of these other terms are keeping track of choice statistics on different time scales. So old choice is keeping track of what choice the animal just made. Trial since last switch is how long the animal's been in the current bout. And cumulative choice is how many times the animal has made each choice period. And so this basically keeps track of like immediate previous choice, what it's been doing for the current event, and then total how often has it made every choice. And actually the way that it uses these choices is in order to modulate reward-independent behavior for the most part, which means it's using this multi-timescale information in order to modulate how it's alternating between extended bouts of exploitation, of choosing what seems to be the optimal choice, and punctuated by these bouts of structured exploration, where the human will cycle between different choices or try each choice a couple times. So it seems to use this like in a way to guide exploration. And the extent to, I think one thing we were all a little bit surprised by and intrigued by is the extent to which reward-independent computation was really dominating a large chunk of this code. Some other things we see are novel forgetting patterns. One thing we saw, and we saw this in some of our other animals too, is that we get this forgetting pattern where the Q values decay towards the mean across all Q values. Basically, the value estimate you have for the current action is going to be biased towards the values you have for other actions too. That's kind of interesting. It might have some kind of interpretation in prior literature, but it looks like a novel pattern. And then we also see more standard forgetting patterns like decaying towards 0. So that was the human program. For the rat program, I won't go through this one in as much detail. We see some similar trends and some different ones. The most salient difference is that the best program for rat started from full model. That basically means the best program we got started from the human baseline that we gave it. And this was the only data set in which all elements of the baseline were also preserved. Kevin Miller modeled this task when he was in graduate school and ended up adopting something that was kind of an early version of a data-driven approach, but manual. He manually searched like lots and lots of different operations that you could put in a model update. And the parameters that, or the terms that he found seem to have survived many iterations of evolution here. We also see that variable names are preserved from the prompt. Here it came up with a couple extra parameters and it gave them interpretable names. It did a worse job defining variables and parameters. It defined a bunch of state variables it didn't even use. It also defined 17 parameters when 10 were available. But the ones it used, it seems to have used well. And then it has this thing where it's updating the Q value towards the unchosen arm, which is reminiscent of this decay towards mean pattern that we saw in the humans. So that's something that we're kind of interested and intrigued by. For flies, the best program we got was also from full models, starting from the human handcrafted baseline. We see similar themes. We see interpretable or preserved names. This one did not overshoot on the number of parameters. It overall also just produced a much simpler program. It has code such that rewarded choices are more likely. That makes sense. It has a similar forgetting pattern. And it also has this updating unchosen Q value, which is reminiscent of this decay towards mean. We also saw that it employed a mix of exploration strategies, which Rishika Mohanta, who had been modeling this data set, mentioned that she had also found when she was playing around with different models, although it's not in the final model that they used. Cool, okay, so that's our tour through the best models and some of the things that we thought were kind of interesting about them. The full models are in the preprint if you're curious to look through them more. I grabbed snippets of interesting code, but there's also some uninteresting or hard to interpret lines too, so I don't want to overestimate the extent to which these are interpretable. We also spent a lot of time looking at them, so it wasn't like we just, it just reveals any insights transparently. I wanted to show one of the programs that we got from the low info prompt to highlight the fact that those programs are not just worse at predicting the choices, they're also harder to interpret. They have harder to explain interactions between choice and reward. They multiply them together in ways that don't really make sense. There's trigonometry, which doesn't really make sense. They tend to come up with a bunch of sines and cosines. And the lines are very long. So I think this is kind of interesting both from I doubt these models will generalize as well because they're weirder programs. And they're harder to interpret largely because their parts are unfamiliar. Interestingly, they're not actually technically more complicated chunks of code. Here on the x-axis here, we have the score of the programs. And on the y-axis, we have a complexity measure. And the programs that we got from low info occupy this cluster here, these purple dots, whereas the ones we got from the full model, which produced the best program, are in this cluster of dots here. And this cluster of dots is actually more complex. The full model programs are more complex according to a standard complexity measure, but they're a lot easier to look at and see what's going on because they have familiar parts in them. So I think this is really relevant for thinking how will this method do on really new problems where we don't have priors, like you should use a reinforcement learning approach, or use some model that people have already used in this literature. If we don't give it those hints, it's harder to find good programs, and it's also harder to find interpretable programs. The last result I'll show is these interpretability versus complexity results. And I'll show you, it's a similar plot to the last slide, but I'll show you a couple example programs to see what they look like. So we actually defined two different ways of scoring program complexity. The first one is just try to throw LLMs at it again. So this is an LLM-based pairwise complexity score. We basically took pairs of programs and then asked an LLM to rank which one was more complicated. We got a ranking for the database of programs, and the rank was proportional to the score. So a high-ranking program means that it's more complicated, and a low-ranking one means that it's less complicated. On the y-axis here is, again, the Halstead difficulty complexity score. So that's the same y-axis that we had on the previous slide. And the x-axis is, again, how well we're doing fitting the data. So each gray dot is a different program that was generated at some point during the evolution process. And you can see, according to both of these scores, it stands out more with the Halstead complexity score, that there's a bit of a frontier. You can see this trade-off where the highest scoring programs tend to have more complexity, and less complex programs seem to be doing, like the best low complexity scores are not scoring quite as highly. So that suggests we're gonna have some trade-offs in terms of interpretability and score, which is maybe not so surprising. If we look at a couple different programs sampled from this frontier, we can look and see, like, are they actually changing in their complexity? So this blue X is the program, is the best program for this data set, and so that's one of the ones that we've already looked at. This red dot is a different program from the frontier. That's one that's getting a lower score, but is a lot less complex. And this one is implementing something that looks a lot like Q-learning, but has the added elements of perseveration and differential learning rates. So it's learning differently from positive and negative prediction errors. The next one, which I apologize, should be pink, not green, is Q-learning with forgetting towards mean Q. So this is, again, basically a Q-learning algorithm, a standard RL algorithm, but now we have this decay towards mean, so it's Q-learning with this added strange forgetting component. And then the very simplest program is Q-learning with forgetting. So that's Q-learning with only the simple addition of decaying towards the mean. These programs all, I think, like, when we looked at them subjectively, we were like, yeah, those are kind of ordered by our subjective complexity. That's kind of a nice validation of this score matching up with our intuitions. However, the thorny or conceptual problem comes from understanding how to relate these programs to each other. It's reasonable, maybe, if you take my word for it, to think that they do occupy different points along this Pareto frontier. But then what do we do with that information? It's not like this last program is just a simplified version of the one before it. Exactly how we relate them to each other is something that we would want if we really want to interpret different points as, like, related to each other. That the green dot is just a simplified version of the pink dot, is just a simplified version of the red dot, and then they expand in terms of how much information they get. So this is something that we're thinking about how to model now. If folks have thoughts on it, I would be excited to chat about it. But our main strategy is going to be to try to see what kinds of things different lines of code contribute to modeling behavior, and see if we find snippets of code that look computationally different but are actually contributing something similar to the behavior. So to summarize, we can use FunSearch to discover models in the form of Python programs. Hooray. These programs are quantitatively doing well. They're beating the baselines that we had in the literature. They're recapitulating statistical regularities seen in the data. So these are all reassuring things to see so far. They are qualitatively readable with an asterisk. We can look at them and we can get some insights about what's happening in the learning process, but there's still a lot of room for improvement on the interpretability. And to summarize, here were kind of my favorite snippets from the human program, which I think we all agreed was sort of the most interesting one to us.